All right, boys and girls. So, for this week's big question, we're talking about pain. Specifically, why does God allow us to feel it, both physically and emotionally? Well, there's really a lot of ways you could answer this question, a lot of different directions you could go with it. So, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up a few stories of people from the Bible, talk about the pain that they went through, and what we can come to understand from that. So first off, there was a guy named Job. He was a righteous man. He lived following God, and he was absolutely incredibly rich. He had everything a guy at the time could have possibly wanted. Wife, bunch of kids, hundreds upon hundreds of livestock, camels, sheep, etc. Multiple houses. He had everything. But one day in heaven, the devil comes along and says to God, "Hey, you see your servant Job down there? I bet that if everything he had was taken away from him, he would no longer serve you. He would curse you outright." So God says, "All right, give it a shot, but just don't kill him." So very quickly, Job loses everything. All his kids die, his livestock are all stolen, his health starts to dwindle too. He's got all kinds of skin diseases all over him. And so he's basically just sitting there in the dust, scraping himself with the shard of a broken clay pot to scratch himself. And his wife tells him, "You've got nothing left to live for, just curse God and die at this point." But he refuses. And then as he's wondering how all of this could have happened, like what the reason possibly could be for all this, some of his friends come along and are telling him, there must be something you did wrong, that you deserved all this. There's got to be a justified reason for this. And eventually he goes on to curse the day of his own birth, everything. He's asking God, "Why did you allow this to happen to me?" And God comes along and responds, "Who are you to decide what is just? Were you there when I breathed out the stars? Were you there when I created everything you see around you? When I breathed life into all the animals? Were you there? Do you have any say in this, any perspective of how the universe truly works?" Basically telling Job that there are reasons for things that us as humans can't possibly understand. Things God does, he sees that we can't necessarily. It is written as as high as the heavens are from the earth, so are your ways, meaning God, higher than my ways. So the thing is, though, God's got a reason for everything he does, even when we can't necessarily see it. Even when things seem bad, he's still using it for good. Probably a few hundred years after Job, there was a guy named Joseph. So he was one of 12 brothers, but the rest of his brothers all hated him. He was his dad's favorite. So one day when they're all out in the field, they sell him into slavery, and he's taken down to Egypt. And they tell the dad that he must have been eaten by some wild animal. So for years and years and years, he's a slave in Egypt. Eventually, gets falsely accused of some awful stuff, put in prison. But there, he meets two of the Pharaoh's servants, who have been put in prison for something, probably mishandling the king's food or something of the sort. Mishandling the Pharaoh's food, sorry. And one night, both of them have very strange dreams. And Joseph, who has a history with strange dreams, asks God the meaning of their dreams and is able to interpret them for them. The baker is to be executed 3 days later, and meanwhile the butler is to be reinstated to his former position. And sure enough, 3 days later, these things come to pass. And Joseph asks the butler, like, hey, remember me. Like, I did this favor for you. Please remember me. Pay it back at some point. But the butler forgets him, and another 2 years go by. But then the Pharaoh himself has a very strange dream, and no one can interpret it for him. But then the butler remembers. Then the butler remembers Joseph. And he tells the Pharaoh, hey, there was this guy I met in prison. He was able to interpret our dreams. Maybe he can help you. And so the Pharaoh goes and sends for Joseph. Joseph comes and talks to him. And once again, Joseph asks God what the dream means. And God reveals it to him. Basically, the next 14 years, we're going to have some very interesting harvests. The next 7 years, we're going to be incredible plenty, an overflowing of abundance. But the next 7 years after that, horrible famine. And so basically, Joseph tells the Pharaoh, you had better set somebody to store up a bunch of this excess harvest in this next 7 years, so we'll be ready for the famine. And the Pharaoh ends up putting Joseph in charge of it all. And so years later, during the famine, they've got all this grain stored up, and everyone is still able to eat despite the famine, and they're selling grain to the people in nearby land, so they're not starving either, and the entire region is basically saved. And eventually, Joseph's brothers come along to buy grain, and after Joseph reveals himself to them, he basically says, what you intended for evil, God used for good. So even though all these horrible things that happened to him, slavery, being put in prison, all of this, God still had a plan for it all and used it for good to save everyone in the region from famine. Another perfect example is Jesus' death. He suffered and died a horrible death on the cross. And I'm sure, obviously the pain he suffered, but then of course also everyone, his disciples, his family, those who knew him, were horrified at what had happened. They probably didn't think any good could possibly come of this. But little did they know, the entire world was saved through what he did. And when he rose again 3 days later, conquering death, we are all free from sin, as long as we accept his gift of salvation. So, God uses even the worst of circumstances for good. Even when we're going through rough times, pain, and it feels like, how could anything good possibly come of this? He's still got a plan for it all. He's using it for something. Sometimes when I'm going through something, seems like just endless bad circumstances or whatever's going on, I'll sometimes just stop and wonder, what kind of miracle is this for somebody else? Like, even though this isn't necessarily a good circumstance for me, I wonder if this is an incredible miracle for somebody else. I remember a few months back, there was a big power outage at my school, in the middle of class. Everybody was freaking out over it and everything. But later that day, friend of mine was telling me that he was about to give a presentation to his class about Christianity. Super, super nervous for it and everything. But right as he was about to present, the power went out. And so he had to wait. And so as he was waiting for things to get back up and running again, he was just kind of chatting with his classmates, getting back in the game. And by the time he was actually able to present, he was all ready again. Not at all nervous anymore, not psyching himself out. So even though that power outage was, for a lot of people, kind of nerve-wracking, in the end for him, it turned out to be a complete, total miracle. Yeah. So the thing really is, when it comes to pain, why does God let us feel it? There's a lot of different reasons, but the truth is, we can't always, it's not always our place to know for sure. God has his reasons. Sometimes it's for our growth. Sometimes it's for somebody else's growth. Sometimes God has a plan through it too intricate for us to ever grasp. But he has a plan and he has his reasons. One last story I want to share. In Jesus' ministry, there was a blind man he came across one day, and his disciples were asking him, why was this man born blind? Was there some sin that he committed? Was there some sin his parents committed? Like, why did he have to be born blind? Who sinned for this man to have to suffer this? And Jesus said, neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind that the glory of God may be made manifest through him. And then Jesus healed him. All right. Love you guys. Stay blessed.